I stumbled on this sub recently, and it put me in mind of an old story. This happened nearly 20 years ago now. I was dating around at the time, and had a few creepy encounters, but this one absolutely takes the cake. He was an acquaintance my brother had met at a bar and was showing around the local area because this man was new to the country. My brother sets us up because he was apparently desperate for a girlfriend, and I guess I was pretty desperate too because we went on that date together. The date itself was probably the worst first date that I've ever been on. I showed up to the restaurant we were meeting at. He was late, which isn't a huge deal, so I let it slip and we went to sit down. To be honest, I knew from the start that I wasn't really attracted to him, but I thought I would be polite and see if we had a nice night. He started off politely too. He held the door for me, pulled my seat out. It wasn't really necessary, but it was nice anyway. Then, as we sat there waiting for someone to come and take our orders, I was reading the menu, and he started talking about how much his fiancée would have liked this place. That took me by surprise, and naturally, I asked about this fiancée. He revealed that he had a fiancée before moving over here, but he had just left her to move to another country. I asked why they had broken up, and he said they never really broke up as such, but he got fed up of her nagging him, and he just moved away. I really didn't know what to say after that, so I changed the subject and started asking him more about himself and where he used to live. He wasn't really that forthcoming. Eventually, our waiter turned up and began talking to us. To clarify the next part, our waiter was a man of color, and he had an unusual accent for our area. So my date stares blankly at him for a while, then turns to me and says, "Do you understand this guy?" I said that yes, I did understand him, before telling the waiter our orders. After he left, my lovely date continued to shock me. He said, "I wouldn't normally leave ordering to the lady, but that brown guy talked really weirdly, and I didn't get it." Wow. Way to tell me you're a racist and a sexist in one breath. Again, I was speechless for a few moments, before I ultimately got angry with him. I don't remember exactly what I said, but it was something along the lines of, "Well, I'm not such a little lady, so I can order for myself just fine. Thanks. And also, why make any racial remarks?" That's when he got annoyed with me and told me that he wasn't being racist. He just wasn't used to that kind of person where he was from. I pointed out that he wouldn't have met me if he just stuck to people he was used to in his own country. He then calmed down, told me that he wouldn't want that because he's glad to have met me. Honestly, I found that a little weird, given that I didn't see any way to say that this date was going well, and he didn't know me very well at all. But I decided since we had ordered, I would just stay, get my meal, and try to redeem this evening before I leave and never see this man ever again. So I answered some of his questions about me, basic getting to know me, and small talk stuff for the most part. Then he started in about my previous dates, if I was a virgin, whether I would be willing to wait until marriage, and then be submissive to my husband or not. It was at this point that I realized I was most likely on a date with a religious bigot, hence the misogyny, weird attitude to sexual stuff, and all his other closed-minded bullshit. So I settled for, "That's none of your business. Now, I need to leave." I checked the prices on the menu and left money for my half of the food, plus a tip, and got up to leave. He said he didn't see why I was being so unreasonable with him, as though this had been a normal date, but then told me that I couldn't expect him to take my money, because that was an insult to him. "Fine, dude, you want to pay for a meal that's not getting eaten? You pay for it. I'm not so crazy about spending my money that I'll stop you." So I took my money back and walked straight out the doors. I just assumed that, yeah, it was an awful evening, but I wouldn't have to see him again. I wasn't even back to my house by the time my brother started texting me, asking me where I was, because my date had called him in tears, saying that I had gone off for no reason, and he didn't know where I was or what to do. Thankfully, my brother was pretty calm about it and assumed that I had left for a reason. I explained everything to him, and he was just as surprised too. After that evening, we both tried to cut contact. My brother stopped meeting up with the guy, and we both blocked the Facebook account that we had for him. My brother also blocked his number because he wouldn't stop texting him, just to ask about me, alternating between being really worried about me to saying he hoped that I dropped dead. Then he started making endless different accounts on social media just to harass us. He told my brother he didn't know why we weren't talking to him. He posted a bunch of weird posts describing me in detail before going on to call me a lot of horrible names. We just kept blocking them and moving on. But then the harassment got worse. He either found me and followed me at some point, or got my address from a friend and turned up one day, standing around outside of my house, asking to come in to speak to me. When I refused to let him in, he grabbed me by the arm in order to prevent me from going in either, and started to tell me that he didn't want to let me go because I would never find a man who would love me like he did, and that if I walked away from him again, I would regret it one day when I was old and lonely. He went on and on like this for ages and ages, all while I tried to pull my arm away from him, before I finally got fed up and yelled at him to get off of me and leave me alone, before kicking him as hard as I could, right in the shin. He let go of my arm, yet cursed at me all the same, and said I was being ungrateful to him. But I took that opportunity to run inside and lock the door behind me. He followed me and started banging on my door, then attempted to push it inwards. I was getting both upset by this man and super fed up of his presence in my life. So I grabbed my phone and called the police, telling them that someone was trying to get into my house. I was told that an officer would arrive soon, but 20 to 30 minutes later, there was no sign of them anywhere. And I was getting even more upset because this man was now forcing my door, and I thought that the lock was going to break soon. So I called my brother, who happens to live nearby, just because I knew he would be there in an instant, even though I wasn't so sure he'd be able to help much. About 10 minutes later, my brother turns up, and after a brief conversation, I didn't quite hear what was going on outside, but the pressure on the door was now gone. I waited a few minutes and then texted my brother to see what was going on and if it would be all right to look outside now. He didn't reply, and the next thing that I heard was the police turning up. I went out to see what was going on, and apparently after my initial call, they had received another call from a neighbor saying that there were two men fighting on my lawn. I surmised that this was my brother and the guy, since my brother looked out of breath and pretty shaken up, but the guy wasn't around anymore. My brother explained to the police that he had tried to stop the man from getting into my house. Then the man had turned and hit him. I told my side of the story, and some of my other neighbors were asked what they had seen and were able to tell them about his attempts to get in. Plus, there were even visible marks on the outside of the door where he had repeatedly tried to get in. The police went to look for him, and a few weeks afterward, I was called and they told me they had found him, but when they wanted me to look at the suspected person, it wasn't the same man. I didn't hear anything else, and I don't know what happened to him. I didn't see him again, so I'm probably safe after 20 years. But regardless, I still find myself thinking, what if, on regular occasion. My mom has told me an alarmingly high number of creepy stories from her younger days, but this one in particular is the reason I triple check my windows and doors before bed each night. This started when she was 23 years old, freshly moved out of her parents' house into a garden floor apartment back in the early 80s. She grew up in Palatine, Illinois, northern suburb of Chicago, and was working as a bank teller. She was 5 feet tall, maybe weighed 100 pounds soaking wet. She was this cute young girl excited to start the next chapter in her life, and admittedly, more than a little naive. Like any job, she became familiar with her coworkers, regular customers, and other workers who worked in the area that she would often see. She told me about a cute guy that would walk by the bank that she saw nearly every shift. Her and the other bank girls would always chatter about how gorgeous he was. And one day, to my mom's delight, he came into the bank and asked her to dinner. Let's call this man Tom. Tom offers to pick her up. She gives her address, and they agree to 7 p.m. for that upcoming Saturday. The date went fine. She described him as awkward and nervous, with a lack of anything to talk about. He dropped her back off a few hours later. She told him thanks, but when he asked her out for a second date, she politely declined and said that she saw Tom more as a friend. She went to work on Monday, gossiped with the girls a bit about the topic. They stopped seeing Tom walk by the bank, and my mom thought that that would be the end of it. Although sadly, it was just the beginning. After they stopped seeing Tom walk by the bank, my mom all but forgot about him and met my dad at a local dive bar a few weeks later. House, bar, bank, all within walking distance from each other, just as an FYI. 2 months go by since her date with Tom, and one night she gets home from work to find that her apartment had been broken into. Front door is wide open, but all that had been taken were some of her undergarments. Nothing else was touched, aside from her underwear drawer. Weird, but she thinks this sort of thing happens. It was a crummy lock, so her dad comes over the next day and puts deadbolts on the front and back doors. The back door in a garden unit, mind you. The door is actually attached to the laundry room of the building, and that laundry room is directly accessible from the backyard without a key. A week goes by, and one morning she sees her upstairs neighbor, Janet, a 50-ish female, in the main hallway. Janet tells my mom that the night before, when she came home from work, she saw a man at my mom's front door messing with the handle. Janet heard the fumbling and actually had my mom's spare key, so the only reason she even walked down the stairs to the garden area was because she thought my mom may have been locked out. Obviously, that wasn't the case. She asked the man what he was doing, and he just ran up the stairs and darted out of the building. Mom luckily slept at my dad's that night. Nothing happens for nearly another month. My mom tells me stories of how that month, she always had a gut feeling that someone was watching her, but never saw anything, so she chalked it up to her being paranoid, given what had happened. Then, one stormy Friday evening, my mom went to bed early because she had the morning shift at the bank the next day. Lights out by 10 p.m., and her fan on full blast. She falls asleep nearly right away. She wakes up around 2 a.m. to the faint sound of drilling. She thought it was odd, but it only lasted a couple of minutes, so she shrugged it off, thinking maybe a neighbor was making a late-night snack. She tries falling back asleep, but all of a sudden, her fan shuts off, and she realizes that the power is out. She gets out of bed and sees that the houses across the street from her all still had their porch lights on. Odd that it was only her building that was out. She's now getting really bad vibes, standing there in her living room, where both the front and back doors are. Standing in the complete dark, she hears banging coming from the shared laundry room area. Mom described being literally frozen, staring at the door, when she suddenly sees the doorknob turn and a hand come in attempting to undo the safety chain. She screams and bolts out the front door, up to Janet's apartment, bangs on the door, and Janet lets her in. Mom is hysterical, and Janet comforts her while her husband Ray goes to check everything out and asks a neighbor to call the police since they don't have power to do so. Police check the perimeter, see nothing, and say they'll come back in the morning once they can see what's going on in the daylight. Mom spends the rest of that night at Janet's. Morning comes, and they come to find out that someone had drilled a hole in the back door in order to bypass the deadbolt. They had cut the phone lines and the power to the building. Sawdust was sitting in piles in the laundry room along with 2 peepholes that see directly into my mom's living room and bedroom. Someone had been watching her, and whoever it was thought that the night of the storm was the perfect night to make his move. Eventually, my mom moves back home, and they have 0 leads on the case until Tom pops back up at the bank, asking if my mom was around. She wasn't at the time, and the only reason that Tom was ever caught was because he asked the other bank girls if my mom had quit and moved after her break-in. Nothing was ever posted in the newspapers, so there was absolutely 0 ways that he would have known about that had he not been involved. Police go to interrogate him, and they find my mom's panties along with a necklace that she hadn't even realized was missing. It was then that my mom learned that Tom had been in and out of prison for much of his adult life, and it's likely that after all this played out, he simply continued along with that pattern. We don't exactly know what happened to Tom after this, but we're just happy that he didn't get to her, because who knows what would have happened had he been able to. This story happened to me back when I was in my early 20s. I used to work at a major media corporation as a digital producer. It was one of my first jobs out of college, and I was super excited to get dressed up every morning in my Zara pants and go to work in a fancy office. Our team was based out of Connecticut, but luckily I had a super cool boss that often let me work from our NYC location, which was much closer to my apartment in Brooklyn. Because I was hot desking and not a permanent member of our Manhattan staff, I often found myself sitting next to a sassy woman with a heavy New York accent who worked in facilities. She had that big maternal energy that Latin and Italian mamas often have, where everyone is their child and everyone is invited over for dinner. I loved sitting in the seat and shooting the shit with her. It made what were often monotonous days feel like fun. I eventually locked down this desk space as a semi-permanent thing, meaning I got to know this woman pretty well. Because my own mother was far away, I developed a close bond with this particular lady. I knew she had a son around my age, and as we got closer, she started to talk about him more and more. She would tell me how handsome he was, how successful he was as a teacher, and how much his students loved him. And more times than not, these conversations ended with her suggesting that he and I should date. Now, for reference, I'm a lesbian and had a serious girlfriend at the time, so whenever she mentioned this, I just smiled and changed the subject. Eventually, I told her about my girlfriend, but that still didn't stop her endless refrain. "You don't understand. You'd look great together. He's such a gem, and he'll treat you like a queen." This was the early 2000s, mind you, so it didn't occur to me to speak up for myself or tell her how problematic it was to try and push a significantly younger gay coworker into a relationship with her son. I was also raised in the South, where manners are paramount, so I simply let it go. Eventually, the woman's son started seeing someone, and at this point, the conversation entirely changed. Now, her pleas to date him were replaced with humble brags about how wonderful his girlfriend was, how much she adored her, and how in love they were. The pair eventually got married, and my coworker was over the moon. And truth be told, I was happy for her as well. I knew just how much she wanted her son to meet someone. And not only that, but it got her off my back. After several years, I moved on from this job, but kept in touch with my facility's friends. Every once in a while, we'd message each other on Facebook with some greeting or inside joke. And then after a few years, even those stopped. But because I still followed her on social media, I was among the first to find out when her daughter-in-law was murdered. At first, the authorities thought it was a gang thing. The daughter-in-law taught at an inner-city school and had overheard some concerning talk of murder. Maybe she had been targeted. But as more and more information came out, one thing became abundantly clear. The police were not looking at this as a random act of violence. They were looking much closer to home. And it didn't take long before they zeroed in on my friend's son. It turned out he was seeing prostitutes instead of going to graduate school like he had told his wife. And when she found out and confronted him, he pushed her down the stairs before stabbing her to death while she lay there injured. Police found searches for throat slashing, neck snapping, bleaching bloodstains, and destroying DNA evidence on his computer. There were even rumors that his mom had helped him cover his tracks. I often look at my old coworker's Facebook now and wonder how she's doing. She still has a picture of her son and former daughter-in-law as her profile pic. My heart aches for the family that had to say goodbye to their daughter way too soon. And I also thank God that I am who I am and never accepted that date.